For more on this, let's bring in my guest, Tom Dupree. He served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President George W. Bush, and he joins us now from Washington. Great to see you today, and I appreciate your expertise on this, Tom. Let's start with the issue, if we can, of the actual indictment, because it's being written about by people who are analysts and others that it really doesn't have anything to do with the man who now sits in the White House. Your thoughts?
I think that's a fair analysis, Harris. My sense on this is, look, this was Bob Mueller's opening salvo, and it's obviously extremely significant that Manafort was indicted. But at the same time, I think it's notable about what the indictment does not say. In other words, there's nothing in this indictment that links the Russians to the Trump campaign. They certainly talk a lot about things that Manafort did long before he came into the Donald Trump universe. But the key piece of this that we haven't seen yet is that link that links what Manafort did in Russia with the Russians to the Trump campaign or to the president himself.
If you were to sit across from Paul Manafort, Rick Gates today, as a judge is going to, and we're learning more about this judge, by the way, she was the person, Judge Robinson of the D.C. courts was the person who, Marion Barry, remember him, D.C. mayor back in the 80s and 90s, pleaded guilty to tax evasion in front of her in her courtroom. What would you ask Manafort and Gates? What would you be looking for today? And what are we expecting in this appearance arraignment type situation?
Well, I think today's hearing is going to be somewhat anticlimactic. There's always the possibility that Manafort and Gates will have to kind of run through the media scrum to get to the courthouse and that sort of thing. But from a legal perspective, today's hearing is going to be anticlimactic. I would anticipate that they will enter an initial plea of not guilty, and the prosecutorial engines will start firing up from that point. So we will see over the next few months a lot of pressure being brought to bear on these defendants to enter a plea agreement and cooperate with the special counsel, to tell them everything that they know in exchange for a reduced sentence. That is what the spotlight is going to be on over the next few months, about whether Manafort and Gates are willing to tell their story in exchange for leniency.
What impression does it make on you that we've already seen one guilty plea, albeit it wasn't about what he did, but actually not being truthful, George Papadopoulos, who worked with the campaign?
Right. What that tells me is that a lot of it is just when you meet with these federal agents, if you haven't done anything wrong, or frankly, even if you have done something wrong, you need to be 100% honest. Today's unsealing of that plea agreement shows that what he ultimately pled guilty to was not any sort of underlying substantive violation of the espionage laws or conspiring with the Russians or anything like that. Instead, it was just telling falsehoods to federal agents. And that is the key here, is that once you have federal agents beginning an investigation, asking you questions, you need to take those extremely seriously so that you don't make a misstep, like seems to have happened in this case, and say something that's false when you need to be telling the truth.
And how much could that cost him?
Well, it certainly has already cost him in that he's had to plead. I think what the bigger question here is with that plea agreement is, does he have more information to share with Mueller? This is someone who had some connection to the campaign. It appears that he was an unpaid advisor. This was not a traditional campaign in any stretch of the word, and there's a universe of people who claim they were advisors when they were really very far removed from the candidate himself. The question is, what knowledge does he have, and has he shared it with Mueller?
So that's where I want to take you next. So this special prosecutor, special counsel, seems to have gone far afield from where he originally started. And sometimes investigations, he certainly has the right, as I've been reading, to do that, to follow the trail, if you will. But that means you have to tell certain people what they should and shouldn't do. What would you advise the president at this point?
Well, I would advise the president, number one, to make sure that his people are fully cooperating, because as we were saying earlier, once you get in the business of starting to conceal information from investigators, you could run a risk of finding to have violated the law in that respect. So number one is total honesty, total cooperation. And the idea here is the president, it's in his best interest, in my view, to ensure that Mueller can wrap this investigation up quickly. The more this gets dragged out, the more you see people connected to the campaign being brought in for questioning under oath. Who knows what can happen? And that will cause Mueller to expand the scope of his investigation. The president and the White House need to keep this thing narrow. They need to keep it on track, and they need to do everything within their power to ensure that Mueller wraps this thing up in a prompt manner.
Former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for George W. Bush, Tom Dupree, thank you very much for being with us as this news is breaking on this Monday afternoon. Appreciate it.